The first glyph had already gone dark by the time excavation lead Torvon reached the display chamber, and every scholar in the room was pretending they hadn't seen it. He caught the afterimage in the polished floor tiles, a flicker of deep amber, there and gone, like a coal dying in ash. The glyph sat at the base of the Orenthari stele, a slab of dense black mineral taller than 3 veluri standing on each other's shoulders, carved on every surface with script so old that Torvon's people had only managed to translate 9 of its 214 lines. 9 lines in 400 years. The rest remained locked, not because the language was unknown, but because the stele simply would not let the characters resolve. Imaging drones returned static. Tracing styluses skidded off the grooves as though the stone itself flinched. For 4 centuries, the Orenthari stele had been the centerpiece of the Atheran Deep Time collection on Velun Prime, a monument to everything the galaxy had failed to read. And one of its glyphs had just pulsed. Torvon crossed the floor in 3 long strides, his claws clicking on polished basalt. His senior archivist, Drenna, intercepted him with a datapad held flat against her thorax, the veluri equivalent of a hand raised in caution. "Seismic microevent," she said, "sub-threshold." The monitoring array flagged it and immediately reclassified it as instrument noise. Instrument noise doesn't glow amber. I didn't say it did. Drenna's compound eyes tracked the stele's base, where the glyph sat inert again, indistinguishable from the hundreds around it. I said the monitoring array reclassified it, which means the array's firmware has a protocol for this specific event, and that protocol's instruction is to suppress it. Torvon stared at her. Drenna was the finest deep-text analyst in the veluri academic system. She did not speculate, she parsed. "You're telling me the stele has done this before," he said. "I'm telling you someone built a suppression protocol into our own monitoring firmware. Which means someone expected it to happen again." The exhibition hall was enormous, a cathedral of engineered silence, climate-locked at temperatures that preserved materials older than most civilizations. 41 artifacts from the Orenthari excavation sat on raised platforms under individual atmospheric shells, each one tagged with provenance data and a projected holographic summary that Torvon had personally written over the course of 11 years. He knew every piece. He had cataloged the mineral density of their surfaces, mapped their tool marks, cross-referenced their isotopic signatures against 900 other sites across the outer spiral. This was his collection, his life's obsession, and in 400 years not one piece had ever done anything. He pulled up the glyph's image capture on his personal unit, the half-second of amber light frozen in mid-pulse. It was the 47th glyph in the stele's lower register, a character his translation team had tentatively mapped to a concept they couldn't quite pin down. The closest rendering in veluri was still waiting. He flagged the event in his personal excavation journal, a habit he had maintained for 31 years, long before the Atheran collection existed. Every anomaly, every microfracture, every isotopic drift. The journal was his real archive, more granular than any institutional record. Entry 7214. Glyph 47, lower register, Orenthari stele. Amber pulse, 0.4 seconds. Monitoring array auto-suppressed. Suppression protocol embedded in firmware, origin unknown, date of installation unknown. Drenna confirms, someone anticipated this. The stele is not inert. It never was. He closed the journal and looked at the stele. It looked back at nothing. It was stone. It was 400 years of silence. But Torvon had spent his entire career believing that silence was not the same as emptiness. The timing could not have been worse. In 6 hours, he was scheduled to open the exhibition's public wing to an interspecies academic delegation, 211 scholars from 38 worlds, including a small contingent from a species so newly integrated into galactic society that their delegation had been flagged as a diplomatic courtesy rather than an academic one. Humans. He had reviewed their credentials out of professional duty. 3 academics in xenoarchaeology and comparative linguistics, 2 graduate students with published papers on pre-contact artifact interpretation, and a woman listed as facilities liaison, whose role he could not quite determine. Her name was Marin Calloway, and her institutional file described her as a maintenance coordinator from a mid-tier Earth university, someone who kept lecture halls functioning, replaced ceiling panels, and fixed projector mounts. She had been added to the delegation at the last minute as a logistical support member. Torvald had noted her inclusion with the mild annoyance of a curator who knew that support staff, however well-meaning, tended to touch things. He spent the remaining hours before the delegation's arrival tracing the suppression protocol with Drenna. The code architecture was dense, layered in a way that resisted standard parsing methods. Every time Drenna isolated a functional strand, it looped back into itself, referencing subroutines that existed deeper in the firmware layers that the Vellery compilers had never flagged because they treated the code as formatting whitespace. "This isn't Vellery code," Drenna said at hour 4. Her voice was flat, the tone she used when a conclusion had become inescapable. "Then what is it?" "The syntax matches a fragment we translated from the resonance horn 18 years ago. The one you published in the Journal of Deep Time Studies. The one nobody believed was functional code." Torvald felt his blood cool. "You're saying the suppression protocol is Orenthari?" "I'm saying the builders of this exhibition hall, 400 years ago, unknowingly incorporated Orenthari code into the monitoring system's firmware. And that code has one function. When glyph 47 on the stele pulses, suppress the reading and log nothing." Entry 7215. The suppression protocol is Orenthari, placed in the building's original construction specifications 400 years ago. It hides glyph 47's activation events. Drenna has identified 11 suppressed events in the archived firmware logs, spanning the entire 4 centuries. The stele has pulsed 11 times. We never knew. Someone or something wanted it kept quiet until the right moment. The delegation arrived in stages. The Kethru mathematicians came first, tall and deliberate, their optical sensors sweeping each artifact with the cold patience of a species that measured time in geological layers. Then the Sorshi bioacoustics team, who spent 40 minutes standing motionless before a carved Orenthari resonance horn, their frond-like auditory organs splayed wide, listening to frequencies Torvald couldn't hear. Then a cluster of Tevari material scientists who immediately requested molecular sampling access and were politely refused. Then, a pack of Jureshi comparative linguists who argued among themselves about whether the 9 translated lines constituted a greeting, a warning, or a property deed. The humans arrived last. Torvald watched them from the upper observation gallery as they entered the exhibition hall in a loose cluster, 3 academics in formal attire that didn't quite fit the climate controls, 2 younger humans carrying more recording equipment than seemed practical, and a woman in the back carrying a toolkit. Marin Calloway. She was shorter than the others, her hair pulled back in a way that suggested function over ceremony. She wore a jacket with the emblem of her institution on the shoulder and boots that had clearly been worn for labor, not presentation. While the academics immediately gravitated toward the projected holographic summaries, stopping to photograph provenance tags and compare them to their research notes, Marin stopped 3 steps into the hall and looked up. Not at the stele, not at any artifact. At the ceiling. Torvald watched her study the atmospheric containment grid, the network of micro-emitters that maintained the climate envelope around each artifact. Her eyes moved along the grid lines with the practiced scan of someone who understood infrastructure. She traced the main power conduit visually, followed a branch line to the nearest atmospheric shell, assessed the junction where it met the environmental controls, and nodded slightly, as though confirming something she had already suspected. Only then did she look down at the exhibition floor. Her gaze landed on the stele. And Torvald, watching from above, saw her stop. It was not the stop of a scholar encountering an object of study. It was not the polite pause of a tourist absorbing scale. It was the stop of someone who had been walking through a familiar room and suddenly heard a sound that didn't belong. Her shoulders shifted. Her chin dropped half a degree. Her right hand drifted toward her toolkit and then pulled back. She stood there for 4 seconds. Then she moved on, following the delegation toward the guided portion of the exhibition. Entry 7216. The human maintenance worker stopped when she saw the stele. Duration, approximately 4 seconds. She was not reading the provenance tag. She was not examining the holographic summary. She was looking at the stone itself. Non-specialists do not look at the stone itself. They look at our explanations of the stone. He checked the monitoring array's passive sensors on the stele during that 4-second window. Glyph 47 had not pulsed. The suppression protocol would have hidden it if it had. But the stele's baseline thermal signature had shifted by 0.003 degrees during the exact interval Marin Calloway stood motionless in front of it. A change so small it was indistinguishable from sensor drift. Except that the stele's thermal signature had not varied by a single thousandth of a degree in 26 years of continuous monitoring. He checked twice. The data held. Something in the stele had noticed her. Torvald spent the next hour reviewing every thermal record the monitoring array had ever captured for the stele. 400 years of perfectly flat data, not a single fluctuation. Then, 6 hours ago, the glyph pulse. And now this, a temperature shift so subtle it could have been noise, timed to the second when a human maintenance worker stopped and looked at the stone. He added a line to his journal entry, thermal microshift during her proximity. 0.003 degrees, first recorded variation in the stele's baseline temperature. Duration coincides exactly with her pause. The stele noticed her the way she noticed it. Both of them recognized something. Neither of them can explain what. The guided tour lasted 3 hours. Torvald delivered it personally, walking the delegation through each artifact's context, the Orenthari civilization's estimated lifespan. 11,000 years of verified activity, followed by a disappearance so complete that not even their waste products survived. The mineral compositions that defied known geology, the script that resisted translation not through complexity, but through what Torvald privately called active refusal. He paused at the stele. 211 scholars arranged themselves in a half circle. Recording drones hovered at the regulation distance. The air in the exhibition hall was perfectly still. The Orenthari stele is the single most intact artifact from the Orenthari period, Torvald said, and despite having delivered these words over 1,000 times, the familiar charge still ran through his thorax plates. 214 lines of script. In 400 years, we have translated 9. The remaining 205 lines are not encrypted, not degraded, and not written in an unknown language. They are written in a known script, a script we have successfully decoded on smaller, fragmentary artifacts. The characters are identical. The grammar is consistent, and yet on this stele the text will not resolve. A Kethru scholar raised a limb. You mean the imaging equipment cannot resolve it? No, Torvald said. I mean the text itself will not resolve. We have used direct optical scanning, quantum state imaging, tactile tracing, and molecular layer photography. In every case, the characters appear to shift at the moment of capture, not randomly, deliberately. The stele is not illegible. It is refusing to be read. Silence. This was always the part where delegations shifted uncomfortably. Torvald did not care. He had 31 years of data that supported the claim. The stele was not passive. It was selective. Has it ever responded to any input? Dr. Thomason asked the delegation's lead xenoarchaeologist. No, Torvald said. In 400 years, no stimulus, no query, and no contact has produced a response. He did not mention the glyph pulse. Not yet, not until he understood the suppression protocol. From the back of the group, Marin Calloway said nothing, but Torvald noticed her eyes were not on him. They were on the steel's base, on the exact position where glyph 47 sat, dark and inert. She was looking at the right spot. The tour continued past the resonance horn, the navigation prisms, 3 crystalline objects that aligned with no known star charts but maintained perfect geometric relationships with each other regardless of placement. And the fragment collection, 209 pieces of carved material too small to assemble, each one carrying characters that could be read individually, but formed no coherent sequence when arranged. He showed them the reconstruction attempts, the failed pattern-matching algorithms, the 37 linguistic dead ends. Through all of it, he kept one compound eye on Marin Calloway. She stayed at the back. She did not ask questions. She did not take notes. But 3 times, Torvald saw her hand drift toward her toolkit, the unconscious gesture of a worker who recognized something broken and wanted to fix it. And once, when the delegation paused at the resonance horn, she tilted her head in exactly the same way she had tilted it at the stele. She was listening, not looking. Near the end of the tour, one of the human graduate students, a young man named Chen, approached the fragment collection's display case and asked why the fragments couldn't be assembled. Every possible permutation has been tested, Torvald said. 94 billion configurations over 212 years. None produced a coherent sequence. Maybe they're not supposed to form a sequence, Marin said from the back of the group. Every head in the delegation turned. It was the first time she had spoken during the entire tour. Her voice was even, conversational, carrying no academic weight, the tone of someone making an observation rather than a claim. What do you mean? Torvald asked. In old stonework, really old, pre-industrial masons would sometimes set individual stones into different buildings across a town, not as fragments of one message, as resonators. Each stone would carry one note, and the buildings would carry different notes, and the town itself would produce a chord that no single building could produce alone. You only heard the full thing if you stood in the right spot. The fragments aren't parts of a message, they're parts of an instrument. The Jureshi linguists erupted in simultaneous overlapping debate. The Kethru mathematical delegation began recalculating. Torvald stood very still, his claws pressing into the floor, and felt the specific vertigo of a man who has spent 31 years asking the wrong question. Parts of an instrument, not a text to assemble but a harmonic array. Each fragment tuned to a frequency, and the frequencies combining to produce something none of them could produce alone. He did not write a journal entry. He did not need to. Some realizations wrote themselves directly into the bone. The tour ended at the 17th hour. The delegation dispersed to their assigned quarters. Torvald sent Drenna to cross-reference the suppression protocol's code fragments with every piece of Orenthari text in the Veluri archive, then returned to his office and pulled up the firmware logs. 11 suppressed events across 4 centuries. He plotted the timestamps. The first 3 were clustered in the steel's first decade in the collection, 392, 387, and 381 years ago. Then a gap of 90 years. Then a 4th event, 291 years ago. Another gap of 130 years. Then events 5 through 9 came in an accelerating series, 161, 98, 54, 31, and 12 years ago. Event 10 was 3 years ago. Event 11 was this morning. The intervals were compressing. Whatever the stele was waiting for was getting closer. He plotted the intervals against known galactic events and found nothing. Against changes in the exhibition hall's infrastructure, nothing. Against the galactic political landscape, first contact events, new species integrations. Earth's first contact with the galactic community was 14 years ago. Event 10, the steel's first pulse in 19 years, happened 3 years after Earth's integration. Torvald sat very still. Entry 7217. The steel's pulse frequency correlates with humanity's proximity to the galactic community. The intervals compressed dramatically after Earth's integration. This morning's pulse occurred on the day of the first human delegation's visit. Correlation is not causation, but the Orenthari did not build artifacts that responded to coincidence. He pulled up Marin Calloway's personnel file again. Maintenance coordinator. No academic credentials in archaeology, linguistics, or xenoarchaeology. No published work. A woman who fixed ceiling panels and projector mounts. But her file had one detail he had skimmed past. Her undergraduate thesis, completed 22 years ago at a university so small it barely registered in galactic networks. The title was Resonant Frequencies in Pre-Industrial Stoneworking. How Ancient Builders Tuned Their Monuments. She had studied stones that sang. On a planet that had only made galactic contact within the last century, a young woman had written a thesis about the relationship between carved stone and resonant frequency, the exact intersection the Orenthari stele occupied. She had then spent 2 decades not in academia, but in maintenance, applying that understanding to keeping buildings functional, tuning acoustic environments, assessing structural integrity through vibration. She had not abandoned the frequency. She had lived inside it. Entry 7218. She stopped when she saw the stele. She looked at the stone, not at our explanations. She tilted her head at the resonance horn the way a tuner tilts toward a vibrating string. I am going to do something I have never done in 31 years of excavation work. I am going to ask a facilities liaison to examine an artifact. He disabled the suppression protocol at 300 hours. Then he sat in the exhibition hall, alone, surrounded by 41 silent artifacts, and waited. At 3:47, Glyph 47 pulsed again. Amber light, slow and deep, like a heartbeat pushing warmth through cold stone. The monitoring array captured it cleanly this time, the full electromagnetic signature, the thermal profile, the acoustic resonance that accompanied it. The resonance was subtle below veloury hearing, carried through the floor tiles and the support columns and the building's deep foundation in a sustained vibration that felt more like a memory of sound than sound itself. He ran the frequency through every linguistic database in the veloury archive. No match. Through mathematical libraries, Sorshi bioacoustic catalogs, Tavari material science indices. Nothing. At 400, he ran it against the human academic databases uploaded as a courtesy for the delegation. The frequency matched a tonal value in pre-industrial human music. A note. A single sustained note, common across multiple human cultures separated by oceans and millennia, used in ceremonies the databases described as consecration of stone, the ritual blessing of a new building, a bridge, a monument, a grave marker. The note was older than any human written language. It appeared in acoustic records from stone structures dating back 8,000 years. A homing frequency, carved into human ceremonial tradition so deeply they had carried it forward through their entire civilizational history, without knowing what it was for. Torvald's claws went still on the console. He pulled up Marin's observation from the tour, her comment about the fragments being parts of an instrument, not parts of a text. He cross-referenced it with the frequency data. If each fragment carried a unique resonant tone, and if those tones were harmonics of the base frequency the stele was producing, then the fragments were not a puzzle to be assembled on a table. They were nodes in a spatial array. Their arrangement mattered not as text, but as architecture, the distances between them, the angles, the acoustic geometry of the space they occupied. He reconfigured the fragment collection's display parameters, spacing the 209 pieces according to a basic harmonic distribution model rather than their catalog numbers. It took 40 minutes. When he finished, he ran a resonance scan across the entire array. Every fragment was vibrating, faintly, far below the threshold of any Vellery instrument's default sensitivity, but present, each one producing a slightly different tone, and the tones, taken together, were producing a chord. Marin had been right. The fragments were an instrument. They had been an instrument for 400 years, sitting on display shelves in the wrong arrangement, singing a song no one had thought to listen for. Entry 7218B. The fragments are harmonic nodes, not text, not a puzzle, an instrument. The human maintenance worker identified this in a single observation that took her approximately 12 seconds to formulate. She saw what 94 billion computational permutations could not find because the permutations were testing for meaning in sequence. She was testing for meaning in resonance. Her species thinks in frequency. We think in grammar. The Oranthari, it appears, thought the way she does. He found Marin in the delegation's common room at 600 hours, sitting alone with a cup of something warm, reading a technical manual on her personal device. She looked up when he entered, and he saw no surprise in her face. Only the patient attention of someone accustomed to early mornings and unexpected summons. "Ms. Calloway, I am excavation lead Torvon. I run the Atherin collection." "I know," she said. "Your tour was excellent. You love that stele." The observation was so direct, so stripped of academic politeness, that Torvon had no prepared response. He sat down across from her, a breach of Vellery formal convention he committed without thinking. "I need to show you something in the exhibition hall. I need your professional assessment." "I'm not an academic, lead Torvon. I fix things." "Yes," he said, "that is exactly why I'm asking." She studied him, the same careful, infrastructure-scanning look she had given the ceiling grid. Her eyes moved across his face the way they had moved along the power conduits, reading the structure, assessing the load. Then she picked up her toolkit, left the cup on the table, and stood. "Show me." He brought her to the stele at 6:20. The exhibition hall was empty, the delegation not due until midday. Torvon had closed the atmospheric shells on every artifact except the stele, creating a sealed acoustic environment around the single piece. The hall was so quiet he could hear his own circulatory fluid. Marin walked to the stele and stood in front of it at a distance of roughly 2 meters. The distance a maintenance worker stands from a wall when assessing structural issues. She tilted her head. She was listening. "Play the frequency," she said. He had not told her about the frequency. "Ms. Calloway." The glyph at the bottom pulsed last night, amber, and again a few hours ago. She said it without looking at him, her eyes still on the stele's surface. "I felt it through the floor in my quarters. Your building's foundation carries the resonance, the support columns act as waveguides, and the floor tiles in the residential wing are the same basalt composite. The vibration propagates. It's faint because your climate control grid is absorbing about 30% of the resonance before it reaches the stone. The atmospheric emitters are dampening it. Your infrastructure is accidentally muffling the stele." Torvon stood rigid, claws locked at his sides, compound eyes fixed on this small human woman who was diagnosing his building's acoustic properties the way she might diagnose a leaking pipe. "How do you know this?" "Because I've spent 20 years fixing buildings, and buildings talk if you listen to their foundations instead of their surfaces." She finally looked at him. Her expression was calm, professional, entirely unperturbed. "The note it's producing, I've heard it before. Not from alien artifacts, from old churches, from stone circles, from hand-carved granite cisterns in villages that haven't existed for 1,000 years. It's a consecration tone, a homing frequency, a note that says, 'Come here.' And your stele is producing it, because something in that stone, recognizes the same frequency in human stoneworking traditions. You've heard this specific frequency. I've spent my career inside it, lead Torvon. Every stone building I've ever worked in produces some version of it. The masons who built them didn't know what they were doing. They tuned by ear, by feel, by the way a chisel rang against a block. But they were all converging on the same note. My thesis identified it 22 years ago. I just didn't know it came from somewhere else. She reached into her toolkit and pulled out a small handheld device, a resonance calibrator, scuffed and dented, clearly used daily. She held it up toward the stele, adjusted a dial with the precise rotation of long practice, and pressed a button. The device emitted a single clear tone. The stele answered. Not glyph 47, all of them. Every glyph on the lower register ignited simultaneously, amber light flooding upward from the base of the slab like sunrise crawling up a canyon wall, slow and inexorable. The light was warm and steady and patient, the color of old gold in afternoon sun, and it illuminated characters that Torvon had spent his career failing to read. Across the hall, the fragment collection responded. Every one of the 209 pieces began to glow, each one pulsing at its own frequency, and the chord they produced together was not sound anymore. It was something that bypassed the ears and registered directly in the chest, a pressure, a recognition, a vibration that felt like remembering something you had never learned. Torvon's thorax plates hummed. The basalt floor transmitted the chord through his claws and into his skeletal structure, and for one disorienting moment he felt as though the building itself was breathing. Marin did not flinch. She stood with her calibrator raised and her eyes on the stele, and the amber light washed over her face the way sunlight washes over a wall at dawn, gradually, inevitably, as though it had been traveling toward her for a very long time. For the first time in 400 years, the characters held still. He could read them. The first line of the lower register said, "The hall is ready. The keeper has come." Torvon's legs nearly folded. He braced against his own weight and stared at the resolved text, his translation matrices confirming what his eyes were seeing, his academic composure cracking along fault lines he hadn't known existed. 400 years, 9 lines, and now, in the space of a single tone from a maintenance worker's calibrator, the lower register was opening line by line, each character locking into resolution as the amber light climbed. The instruments were placed in there, keeping halls across the younger worlds. Stone was taught to remember. Those who carved the remembering into their own stones would carry the frequency in their hands. They would not know. They would only feel the rightness of the note, and pass it to their children, and build with it. And one day a keeper among them would stand before a hall, and the hall would know her hands. Marin stood motionless, the calibrator still raised, the tone still singing from its tiny speaker into the vast silence. She was reading the text too. The monitoring array's translation was projecting onto a secondary display, and the Velory to English conversion was running in real time. "Her hands," she said quietly, "it says her." Torvon checked the original text. The Orenthari script was genderless in most contexts, but in this line the character was specific. The keeper was female. The stele had been waiting for a woman. Marin lowered the calibrator. Her hand was steady, but Torvon could see the muscles in her forearm working not from fear, but from the effort of holding still when every instinct was telling her to move closer. She was a worker. Her hands wanted to work. They wanted to touch the stone, feel the grain, assess the surface the way she had assessed 10,000 surfaces before this one. She was restraining herself out of professional respect for an artifact she had not been given permission to handle. "You can touch it," Torvon said. He heard himself say it and realized he had never spoken those words to anyone in 31 years. The stele was untouchable. Everyone knew that. But everyone had been wrong about the stele for 400 years, and Torvan was done being wrong. Maren stepped forward and placed her palm flat against the stele's surface. The stone was warm, not hot, not radiating warm in the way a living thing is warm, the way a hand-worked stone holds the heat of the person who shaped it. She spread her fingers and pressed, and beneath her palm the carved characters brightened to twice their previous intensity. The amber light spread from her point of contact outward, rippling across the stele's face like light spreading across water. "It's tuned," she said, and her voice held the quiet amazement of a professional encountering work that exceeded her own. "The whole slab, every carved line is a resonator. The channels between the characters are tuned to specific intervals. Whoever carved this didn't just write on stone. They built a stone organ. The text is the music." The amber light reached the middle register. More lines resolved, faster now, as though the stele was accelerating through text it had been holding for millennia and was eager to release. The middle register told the story of the Orenthari themselves. They had not been a single civilization in the way the Veluri understood the term. They had been the species that walked the galaxy when it was young and empty, before any other world had produced a microbe. 11,000 years of uninterrupted development, an entire galaxy to themselves, and they had used it not to conquer or colonize but to catalog. They mapped every world that would eventually bear life. They studied geological compositions and predicted which planets would produce species capable of stone working. And on those worlds, thousands, scattered across every spiral arm, they embedded resonant templates in the mineral strata. Seeds of frequency, tuning forks buried in bedrock. When a species on one of those worlds independently developed the ability to shape stone, the resonance would guide their hands, not consciously, not as an instruction, as a feeling, the feeling that a certain note was right, that a certain angle of cut produced a better ring, that a particular block had a grain that wanted to split along a particular line. Over millennia, the species would converge on the frequency the Orenthari had embedded. And when a member of that species carried the converged frequency in their hands, not in a machine, not in a formula, but in the muscle memory and calloused certainty of someone who had worked stone their whole life, the halls would open. Torvan read the middle register with the focus of a man watching his life's work validated and overturned simultaneously. "The fragments," he said, his voice hoarse. "The 209 fragments. They're not random pieces, they're—" "A map," Maren said. She had lowered the calibrator. The tone had faded. The steel's light had not. "They're coordinates." Torvan turned to the monitoring array. Across the exhibition hall, 37 of the 41 artifacts were registering low-level amber resonance. The navigation prisms were aligning, rotating on their platforms in slow, precise movements, orienting toward fixed points that corresponded to no known star chart. The resonance horn was producing a subsonic hum that Torvan could feel in his chest plates, and the 209 fragments were vibrating at the same frequency, their characters stabilizing, assembling for the first time into a coherent sequence. A network of coordinates, 947 locations across 612 worlds. 947 halls, everyone waiting. Drenna appeared at the entrance, compound eyes wide, a datapad clutched against her thorax. Behind her, the first members of the delegation were gathering in the corridor, drawn by amber light spilling through the observation windows. "Lead Torvan, every artifact in the collection is active, every one, including the pieces we classified as inert mineral samples." "I know." "The monitoring array is receiving structured data from the fragment set, a coordinate system. I've cross-referenced 12 locations against known planetary surveys. They correspond to worlds with dense geological formations rich in quartz, granite, marble, and basalt. Worlds where indigenous species develop stone carving traditions. How many of those species are currently integrated into the galactic community?" Drenna checked her datapad. 43. but only one, developed stoneworking traditions that converge on the frequency the stele is producing. The upper register ignited. 205 lines of script that had resisted every attempt at capture for 4 centuries, now burning steady amber against the black mineral surface. Each character was sharp, absolute, carved with precision that Torvald's instruments had never measured because the characters had never held still long enough. The translation cascaded across his console. The upper register was not narrative. It was an address, a formal greeting carved above a doorway to tell the person entering who they were and why the door was opening. The text named Earth, not by its human name, by its Orinthari designation, a compound glyph that translated as the world that carved its own mountains into temples and never stopped. The Orinthari had watched Earth from a distance of 11,000 years and seen a species that did not merely work stone, but loved it. A species that quarried marble to build structures they knew would outlast them. That carved granite headstones for their dead with the same care they used for palaces. That taught their children to lay brick by hand even after machines could do it faster. That maintained stoneworking guilds and ceremonies across every culture, every continent, every millennium. The Orinthari had seeded thousands of worlds. But Earth was the primary candidate, the world most likely to produce a keeper, because humans did not just work stone. They revered it. They built cathedrals that took centuries to complete, knowing the builders would never see the finished spires. They carved names into war memorials with hand chisels when laser engravers sat in workshops nearby. They kept the old ways alive not because they lacked better methods, but because the old ways felt right. Because the frequency felt right. Because the Orinthari had made certain it would. The final line of the upper register was not a statement. It was an address, carved in characters twice the size of the rest, centered on the stele's crown like a name on a lintel. The amber light behind it was brighter than any other line, a warm, sustained glow that filled the hall with the color of sunrise on sandstone. Torvald read it aloud. His voice cracked for the first time in his professional life. Keeper of the carved frequency, the halls recognize your hands. The exhibition hall was no longer empty. The delegation had filtered in Kethru standing tall and rigid, optical sensors locked on the stele, Sorshi with auditory organs fully splayed, Tavari clustered tight, instruments pointed at every active artifact, Jureshi linguists staring at texts they had been told would never resolve. Dr. Thomason and the human academic stood near the entrance, recording drones deployed, faces carrying the specific pallor of scientists watching their field transform. And in the center of the hall, directly before the stele, Marin Calloway stood with a resonance calibrator in one hand and a toolkit on her hip, reading words carved for her 11,000 years before she was born. She did not step back. She did not gasp or weep or tremble. Torvald, who had imagined this moment 1,000 times across his career, understood that her composure was not shock. It was recognition. She stood the way a woman stands who has just been told something she had always, in some wordless part of herself, already known. "Every old church I ever fixed," she said quietly, "every stone I ever tuned. Every time I put my hand on a wall and knew where the crack was before I looked, they were all saying this." Torvald was reading the secondary output, where the coordinate map assembled from the 209 fragments was now complete, projected in 3 dimensions above the fragment platforms. A galaxy rendered in amber points, 947 halls marked across 612 worlds. "Ms. Calloway, that map contains 947 locations. Each one is a knowledge hall, a sealed repository of Orinthari information, navigation, engineering, biological sciences. Each hall contains a different branch, and this hall," he pointed at the floor, "is the index, the primary archive. It has been beneath the exhibition hall the entire time, embedded in the planetary crust." "Beneath us," she said, "right now." The stele was never the collection's centerpiece. It was the front door. The floor tiles between the stele and the far wall began to glow. Not all of them, a path. A single line of amber light running to a section of polished basalt that Torvald had always assumed was decorative paneling. A seam appeared in the wall, a door-shaped outline, perfectly fitted, invisible until the light touched it. Maren looked at the path. She looked at Torvald. "There's more," she said, not a question. "There has always been more. We just couldn't hear it." She walked the path. Torvald followed, his excavation journal forgotten in his hand, claws silent on the glowing tiles. The door responded to Maren's proximity, not touch, not command, just her presence within 2 meters. The basalt panels slid apart with a sound like a deep bell struck once, and behind them was a staircase descending into light. Not darkness, light, amber light, the same frequency as the stele's glyphs, rising from below like warmth from a hearth. The air that came up from the stairwell was clean and cool, and carried a scent that Torvald could not name, something mineral, something that reminded him of the deep excavation sites where stone had not been exposed to atmosphere for geological ages. The staircase was carved stone. The walls were carved stone. Every surface bore Orinthari script, and every line was legible, resolved, still, glowing with steady luminance. The text was pouring through Torvald's handheld translator faster than he could process. Below the exhibition hall, built into the planetary crust of Velun Prime, was an Orinthari knowledge hall, the real archive, the one the surface artifacts had been pointing toward for 4 centuries. Maren descended with the calm deliberation of a woman walking into a building she had been hired to assess. Torvald followed, compound eyes adjusting to the amber light, professional composure in ruins, archaeological fever burning hotter than it had in decades. The hall below was vast. The ceiling was so high the light faded before it reached the upper surfaces, creating the impression of a carved canyon open to an amber sky. Rows of stone columns stretched into the distance, each covered in resolved script, each humming at a frequency Torvald could feel in his chest plates. Between the columns, on raised platforms identical to those in the exhibition hall above, sat objects. Not artifacts, instruments. Torvald recognized the design language immediately, the same material compositions, the same toolmark signatures, the same isotopic profiles. But these were not fragments. These were complete, intact navigation systems, communication arrays, astronomical charts rendered in carved stone and activated crystal. A civilization's entire operational infrastructure, preserved in a medium that could survive geological time, stone, and keyed to a frequency that only a species with the right relationship to stone could produce. The way humans had. Torvald counted the columns as they walked, 12 rows deep, 14 columns per row, 168 columns, each one a repository in its own right, each carved with dense Orinthari text that the monitoring array on his handheld was translating in a continuous stream. Navigation algorithms, stellar cartography, mineral extraction techniques, biological taxonomies of species that had not yet evolved when the text was carved, atmospheric engineering principles, agricultural models, medical procedures for conditions that afflicted species the Orinthari had predicted would exist in 10,000 years. The scope of it was staggering, not just knowledge but foresight. The Orinthari had not merely recorded what they knew. They had predicted what others would need to know and stored it in advance, indexed by the species that would need it, keyed to the frequency that species would carry. It was the most generous act of intelligence Torvald had ever encountered. An entire civilization's accumulated wisdom, encoded in stone, left unlocked for anyone whose hands could produce the right note. No conditions, no tests of worthiness, no trials of strength or cunning or moral character. The only requirement was that you had spent your life working with stone and listening to what it told you. The Orenthari had chosen the humblest possible key. Not kings, not generals, not scientists or priests or diplomats. Workers, the people whose hands shaped the world while everyone else discussed what shape it should take. Marin walked between the columns, her fingers trailing along carved surfaces, and wherever she touched, the script brightened. A slight intensification, the way a screen brightens when a hand passes near a sensor. The hall was reading her, confirming, column by column and platform by platform, that her hands carried the frequency it had been built to recognize. Behind them, Drenna had followed to the top of the staircase. Her voice came down, tight with controlled astonishment. "Lead Torvon. The Kethru delegation has requested emergency access to the monitoring data. The Sorshi are asking whether the resonance horn is now producing a navigable signal. And Dr. Tomason wants to know," she paused, and Torvon heard the specific quality of a scientist choosing each word with extreme care. He wants to know if the stele's text contains instructions for human stone workers. Specifically, whether it references techniques already known on Earth. "Tell him yes," Torvon said. "Tell them all yes, and then come down here, you need to see this." He stopped at the 7th column and read the resolved text on its surface. It was a manifest, a list of knowledge halls across the galaxy, their locations encoded in Orenthari navigational format, each tagged with the geological profile of its host world, and the species most likely to develop the resonant frequency. Earth was not listed as a curiosity, not as a footnote. Earth was listed as the primary candidate, the world with the highest density of resonant-capable geological formations, the world whose dominant species had independently developed more stone-working traditions than any other in the galaxy, the world the Orenthari had identified, 11,000 years ago, as the one most likely to produce the key. The manifest called Earth stoneworkers, the frequency bearers. It described them not as a primitive species stumbling through early development, but as the inheritors of the Orenthari's central project, the species that would, through its own independent evolution, arrive at the exact resonant relationship with stone that the Orenthari had seeded into the galaxy's mineral foundations. Marin stood at the center of the hall, surrounded by 11,000 years of preserved knowledge, and Torvon watched her face. She was not overwhelmed. She was not exalted. She looked the way she had looked when she studied the ceiling grid, attentive, professional, assessing scope. "How many halls?" she asked. 947, across 612 worlds. "This hall is the index. And they're all keyed to this frequency. To the frequency, and to the hands that produce it. The text is explicit: the halls will not open for scanning equipment, drones, or any indirect method. They open for direct contact, for hands that have worked stone and carry its resonance." She looked at her own hands, calloused, scarred across the knuckles from 2 decades of maintenance work, a chip in one thumbnail from a ceiling panel she had replaced the week before the delegation departed Earth. "I'm a facilities coordinator," she said. "I fix lecture halls." "You are a keeper of the carved frequency," Torvon said, "and according to the manifest, you are not the only one. Every human who has ever worked stone with their hands carries a version of this frequency. The Orenthari identified your species specifically because you produce more stoneworkers per capita than any civilization in galactic history. Your masons, your sculptors, your road builders, your tile setters and foundation pourers, and the laborers who cut granite by hand for structures they would never live to see completed. They are all frequency bearers." The hall hummed. The columns pulsed in sequence, a slow cascade of amber light rolling from the entrance to the deepest visible point and back, like a breath. Marin walked to the nearest platform and placed her hand on the surface of a navigation instrument. The carved stone beneath her palm warmed and brightened, and a holographic projection rose from the instrument's face, a star chart, 3-dimensional, rotating slowly, with 947 points marked in amber. "Each one of these is a hall," she said. "Each one is a complete knowledge repository, and the index here provides the key to which hall holds what." She was quiet, studying the chart, and Torvald recognized the expression. He had worn it himself 31 years ago, standing at his first excavation site on the salt flats of Velun's southern continent, looking at a field of broken stone columns that stretched to the horizon, and understanding for the first time that the work ahead of him was larger than his life. The expression was not fear. It was not hesitation. It was the moment a person accepts that they have found the work they were meant for. "My grandmother cut marble," Marin said, "in a workshop in Vermont. She could tap a block with a chisel and tell you where the grain would split before she made the first cut. She said the stone told her. I thought she was being poetic." "She was being precise," Torvald said. "And her grandmother before her laid fieldstone walls, and her grandmother before that carved headstones in a churchyard in Ireland. We've been doing this for as long as anyone in my family can remember, working stone, listening to it, and it was never just stone." "It was never just stone," Torvald confirmed. Marin walked deeper into the hall. At the furthest visible row of columns, where the amber light began to shade into gold, she stopped before a column that was different from the others. It was taller, broader, carved not with text, but with what appeared to be a portrait, a figure rendered in the Orenthari style, abstract but unmistakably purposeful. The figure had no face, no species-specific features. It was a pair of hands, open-palmed, carved in such precise detail that Torvald could see the individual lines on the palms, the creases at the knuckles, the wear patterns on the fingertips. Workers' hands, carved 11,000 years ago on a world far from Earth by a species that had never seen a human being, and the hands were human, not approximately, not suggestively. The proportions, the joint structure, the ratio of finger length to palm width, all human. The Orenthari had predicted them with absolute precision. Marin raised her own hands and held them beside the carving. The scale was identical. Her calloused fingertips aligned with the carved wear patterns. The chip in her thumbnail matched a small asymmetry in the carving's right hand, an intentional imperfection that Torvald now realized was not an imperfection at all. It was a prediction. The Orenthari had known, 11,000 years ago, that the woman who would come would carry a specific mark on her right hand. She pressed her palms against the carved ones. The column blazed. Not amber but gold, pure, deep, blinding gold that flooded the hall from floor to ceiling and turned the air itself into something luminous. The other columns responded, each one adding its frequency to the chord, until the hall was singing in a register that Torvald had no name for. It was not sound. It was not light. It was the sensation of a lock opening that had been closed so long the building had forgotten it was a building and not a mountain. Then the gold faded to amber, and the singing settled to a hum, and the column bore a new line of text that had not been there a moment before. "The keeper has been recognized. The network is awake. 947 HALLS await her hands." The delegation was descending the staircase, now Drenna leading, the Kethru's optical sensors filling the narrow passage with scanning light, the Sorshi's auditory organs trembling as the hall's resonance washed over them. Dr. Thomason came down last, moving slowly, one hand braced against the carved wall, his face carrying the look of a man who had just learned that the ceiling of his discipline was actually a floor. Torvald met them at the base of the stairs. He did not give a speech. He did not frame the discovery in academic language or soften it with caveats. He pointed at the hall, at the columns, at the instruments, at the star chart hovering above the navigation platform, at the woman standing in the center of it all with calloused hands and a toolkit. "The Orenthari did not disappear," he said. "They finished. They mapped the galaxy, seeded their knowledge into stone, built 947 repositories across 612 worlds, created an index archive beneath this building, and then they left. They left because the work was done. The knowledge was stored. The frequency was embedded. All that remained was the wait. He looked at Marin. The wait is over. Dr. Thomason stepped forward. His recording drone hovered at his shoulder, capturing everything, and his voice carried the careful steadiness of a man who understood he was standing inside the most significant archaeological discovery in galactic history. Lead Torvan. The steel's text the upper register. It names Earth stone workers as inheritors. Not visitors, not guests, not borrowers. Inheritors. What exactly does that mean in Orenthari legal context? Torvan checked the translation matrices. The Orenthari term was precise, and it did not translate to the gentle academic notion of cultural inheritance. It translated to something closer to rightful owners by demonstrated kinship. It means the Orenthari recognized Earth stone workers as their successors, not metaphorically, formally. These halls and everything in them belong to the species that carries the frequency. The knowledge is not loaned, it is bequeathed. The hall was silent except for the humming columns. 211 scholars from 38 worlds stood in the amber light of a legacy that had just been claimed by the newest and most underestimated species in the galactic community, by a woman who fixed ceiling panels for a living. A Kethru scholar spoke. Its voice was precise, measured, carrying no emotion, which in Kethru communication meant the emotion was too large to express through vocal modulation. The Orenthari navigation data alone would advance galactic cartography by approximately 400 years. The biological prediction models would reshape every medical paradigm in the interspecies health compact. The atmospheric engineering principles could terraform worlds currently classified as permanently uninhabitable. It paused. This changes everything. Yes, Torvan said, it does. Entry 7219. I have spent 31 years excavating the surface. The real excavation has just begun. Below the exhibition hall is an Orenthari index archive, the primary hall of a galaxy-wide network of 947 knowledge repositories, all keyed to a resonant frequency carried by human stone workers. The human maintenance coordinator, Marin Calloway, activated the stele, resolved the script, opened the archive. She is not an academic. She is not a diplomat. She is a woman who fixes buildings. And she is exactly what the Orenthari were waiting for. My excavation journal, which I have maintained for 7,218 entries across 31 years, is no longer a record of what I have found. It is a record of what found us. The amber light in the hall held steady. The columns hummed. Drenna's datapad was filling with translated text faster than she could catalog it. The Kethru had gone perfectly still, their species' response to information that exceeded their processing parameters. The Sorshi were weeping. If that was what you called the clear fluid running from their auditory fronds, their species wept from the ears, not the eyes, and it meant they were hearing something beautiful. Marin turned in a slow circle, taking in the scale of it. 947 halls, 612 worlds, a galactic network of knowledge, preserved in stone, waiting for the one species that had spent its entire history shaping stone with bare hands. She turned back to Torvan. Lead Torvan, you've spent your whole career trying to read that stele. Yes. And it took a maintenance worker with a resonance calibrator to turn it on. Yes. She nodded, the small, private nod of a professional who had assessed the scope and accepted the contract. Then I think you and I have an excavation to plan. Torvan looked at her, this small, calloused, utterly unextraordinary human woman standing in a hall of ancient light, surrounded by the preserved knowledge of the galaxy's first civilization, holding a resonance calibrator in one hand and a toolkit in the other, and felt something he had not felt since his first dig, when he was young, and the universe was still full of unopened doors. Archaeological fever. pure, undiluted burning. Yes, he said, I believe we do. Entry 7220. Beginning new excavation. Scope, galactic. Target, the Orinthari Knowledge Hall Network, 947 sites across 612 worlds. Primary access method, direct human stoneworker contact. Lead excavator, still me. Key, Marin Calloway, facilities coordinator, Earth. Status of previous assumptions about the Orinthari, all wrong. Status of the stele, speaking. Status of the exhibition hall, obsolete. It was never a museum. It was always a front door. We just couldn't hear it knocking. The amber light held, the columns hummed. And somewhere far below, in stone older than any civilization the galaxy remembered, the Orinthari waited with the patience of a species that had seeded its inheritance into the bedrock of 1,000 worlds, knowing that sooner or later, a woman with calloused hands and a tuning fork would come along and open the first door. They had waited 11,000 years. They had not been wrong. Above them in the exhibition hall, the Orinthari stele stood in full illumination for the first time in 4 centuries, every glyph burning amber, every line legible, every character resolved. The final line of the upper registered the address, the greeting, the name the stele had held for the one who would come glowed brightest of all. Keeper of the carved frequency. The halls recognize your hands. And in the hall below, the hands it recognized were already reaching for the next stone.